Hi, my name's Allyson Starr, and I'm going to be discussing Jennifer Higdon's work for solo flute rapid fire. With her use of extended techniques and various compositional methods, Higdon produces a wall of sound that portrays a narrative revolving around gun violence. In my research, I took a look at these compositional techniques as well as talked with the composer, Dr. Higdon, with the intention of understanding how flutists might comprehend and interpret the work. Given the amount of unconventional musical notations in the piece, Higdon includes extensive footnotes with instructions for many of the symbols that she writes, many of which are meant to achieve an overblown note. An overblown note is what occurs when a musician alters the airstream that they're using to attack a note in a way that causes the note to sound higher, and in the case of this piece, sometimes a little bit harsher than it typically would. In example 1 on this slide, Higdon writes that the note can be overblown to any harmonic level, which creates a sharper sound that interrupts and pierces through the line preceding it. It sounds a little something like this. It allows for a longer line to be brought out of the texture, which when compared to example 2 is quite different. Example 2 is meant to bring out specific pitches in a line as opposed to the entire line. It's notated with 2 martellato accents that are stacked on top of one another and sounds like this. Higdon will later use this to develop various motivic figures and pitch class set motives. Examples 3 and 4 are rather similar to one another in that they both aim to create a whirlwind of sound, almost imitating a car speeding by and creating a rush of air. Higdon provides the flutist with an illustrated contour for how she would like the phrase to be shaped, but overall, the harmonic content and the development of the line is left up to the player. When I talked to Dr. Higdon about this notation, she said that while example 3 should be a super fast up and down fluctuation of air, example 4 indicates that the player should launch an initial blast of air into an overtone and then subsequently ease down from that while following the general contour. So example 3 would sound like this. Whereas example 4 would sound like this. The final extended technique that I'm going to be looking at is seen in example 5, notated by the small dots above the notes. This notation calls for the player to start overblowing in spurts according to the concentration of the dots above them. Oftentimes it's accompanied by the instruction of sporadic tonguing, which you can see in this example. Higdon describes this technique as being a sort of stress-inducing effect. In our conversation, she said, "I didn't want to have to tell the player where to overblow and where not to overblow, so the little circles that are above just show sporadic overblowing. Then when I realized that it wasn't necessary that people would have to slur or articulate certain notes, I could make more anxiety in the line if I just wrote sporadic tonguing on top of the overblowing." So that would sound like. While certain sections of rapid fire sound almost scattered or isolated, the work is tied together by several motivic figures, each with strong affiliation to the narrative. In such an experimental and innovative work, repeated motivic content allows for the listener to recognize consistency and sort of have something to listen for. One of the more notable motives is first seen at the opening of the piece after 2 rather aggressive trills and sounds like this. It consists of the note A flat, and B flat, which when translated into integers is 9, 8, 10, and then this turns into pitch set class of 3, 1, 0, 1, 2. It also has a contour segment of 1, 0, 2. This is incredibly reminiscent of 3 other notable unaccompanied flute pieces of the 20th century, the earliest of which being Debussy's Syrinx, which opens with, the next of which being Brez's Density 21.5, which opens with, and the latest being Barrios' Flute Sequenza. These all sound a little bit similar because they share the same pitch set class and the contour segment. Barrios stated that his piece, Sequenza, is meant to sort of tip his hat to his predecessors with the opening. So when I asked Dr. Higdon about this relation, she claimed that the reference was probably not at the forefront of her mind while composing, but the pieces were most likely floating around in her subconscious due to the significance of flute literature. By bringing out this particular motive, the flutist is able to successfully highlight the figure, which adds overall significance to the gesture. Higdon also uses various tactics to achieve a sense of interruption, which becomes motivic. There are multiple examples that showcase how Higdon will set up a precedent for a line and then implement a contrasting figure to create an interruption. In example 6 on this slide, you can see that Higdon introduces ascending scalar riffs, which are then interrupted by a very harsh trill, which is interrupted by some running eighth notes, which is interrupted by another harsh trill, which goes on for a while and creates a sort of domino effect. By using these techniques to create color changes, Higdon creates a contrast in timbre, which allows the player to intensify the phrase. So example 6 would sound like this. conversation, Higdon expressed that her use of set theory was purely intuitive, stating that as a flute player, she recognized that certain combinations of notes were simply easier to finger quickly, which led to a lot of recognizable groupings of notes. Example 7 is found in the middle of a rather chromatic section, but Higdon notates for the flutist to overblow a segment of the whole tone scale, which brings it out of the texture. So that would sound like. And then this sort of breaks the line in a very succinct manner. Example 8, however, focuses on chromaticisms within the lines. The notes that are accented and then therefore brought out the texture outline a series of trichords, all members of family 1 with a half step and an increasing span. So that would sound like. In order to effectively highlight these changes within the line, the player might try to bring out the pitches that expand the span of the gesture, which in the case of the first 2 trichords, which are circled in red, would be the Fs, and the second trichord circled in green would be the G flat, and finally in the third trichord circled in blue would be the D. In my conversation with Higdon, she expressed that the piece is based on an occurrence in 1992, in which a college student was shot and killed in her Boston home. And Higdon said that it resonated with her that a girl was hit by a stray bullet, and it was striking that someone wouldn't even be safe in their own home. In order to capture this narrative, Higdon articulates various gestures that are able to encapsulate violence in the piece. The work itself takes a massive amount of endurance from the flutist for a 5-minute piece. The tempo is marked at 180 to 200 beats per minute, and there are very few rests, which leaves the player with little to no time to catch their breath or even really turn a page. However, in the rather chaotic feeling work, there are 2 instances of seeming tranquility, both of which represent the sound of passing sirens. The first of which can be seen in example 9 and has this dotted rhythm with a multiphonic on D5 and F5, which drops down to an F4. This produces a very hollow tone, similar to the next instance, which more or less creates the same effect. The most violent aspect of the whole piece is debatably the last gesture of the work. The ending of Rapid Fire uses a snap and pop, which is pictured at the bottom of the slide if you don't know what that is. When thrown at the ground, the device creates an explosive sound, which creates a very high-intensity end to an already very exciting piece. So the ending would sound like this. So in conclusion, with her use of extended techniques, motivic content, and then compositional techniques, Higdon's able to portray this violent narrative. Through a player's understanding of these tactics, the player is then able to then better communicate that. So that was my not-so-rapid analysis of Jennifer Higdon's Rapid Fire.